in Surrey. Then, over the long, cold winter, there had been a lull. It was as if the jewel thief had vanished into thin air. That was until 10 days ago. Lady Rimington had been staying with her niece, Mrs. Adele de Vere, in Mayfair. Mr. de Vere was a wealthy industrialist. There had been a dinner to celebrate Lady Rimington's 60th birthday. By all accounts, it had been a very grand affair. However, when the guest of honour had woken up the following morning, she'd realised her diamond tiara was missing from her dressing room. Like all the other thefts, the stolen jewels were extremely valuable and had been taken without any visible signs of a break-in. All doors and windows were locked from the inside, and the jewels had disappeared while the occupants were sound asleep. The detectives were convinced that in each case a servant must be involved, and that whoever was behind the thefts was bribing them to help him gain access. Yet they were still no closer to solving the crimes. All the servants at each address had been interviewed and their backgrounds checked. Dorothy had collected a large file of their names, ages, references, and all other relevant details. The maid sitting next to her now was one Siobhan O'Neill, aged 20, born in County Cork, but employed by the De Veres as a parlour-maid for the last 3 years. The young woman blew her nose loudly. Taylor tutted and shook his head. "Very well, Miss Peto. Take her out of here." Then raising his voice and wagging his finger, "You're free to go for now, young lady. But mark my words, we'll be keeping an eye on you." He stomped out of the room, followed by Brooke, while Dorothy helped the girl to her feet and escorted her to the main door. She watched as Siobhan dashed across the street and into the arms of 2 other young women, who Dorothy guessed from their striking red hair must be related to her. It was the second time this particular maid had been brought in for questioning, but as far as Dorothy could see, her only crime was being Irish. Sergeant Taylor had what Dorothy thought was an irrational but unshakable belief that it was Irish Republicans who were behind the thefts and that they were using the jewels to finance their political fight against the British. Back in 1914, he had been involved in the arrest of several members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They had been caught stealing a shipment of rifles meant for the front from the arsenal at Woolwich. Every house that had been burgled employed at least one Irish servant, and Taylor was certain there must be a link between them and the Republicans. The previous year's Easter Rising had cemented his conviction. Dorothy had attempted to argue that there were, in fact, plenty of brave Irishmen fighting for the British over in France and Belgium, but it did no good. Taylor was adamant he was right. As well as getting used to her colleagues' quirks, Dorothy had also grown accustomed to their individual prejudices. They each had their own theories about who was behind the jewel thefts. Sergeant Clark seemed to think either the Communists or the Germans were involved somehow, even though almost all enemy aliens, as they were now called, had been interred at the start of the war. When pressed on the matter, Sergeant Brooke, as usual, said very little other than, "Plenty of villains in London, without needing to import any, Miss Peto." Privately, Dorothy preferred the idea that the burglaries were being carried out by a gentleman jewel thief like Raffles in the novel by E.W. Hornung, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's brother-in-law. It made more sense to her that someone familiar with the members of the upper classes and the houses they visited was responsible for the crimes, than a bunch of hard-drinking, violent Republicans or any other foreign political agitators. She hadn't dared voice her thoughts, though. The detectives seemed to have accepted her as part of their team, and she didn't want to give them or Inspector Derwent any reason to doubt their decision to let her work with them. Actually, the inspector hadn't said who he thought might be behind the jewel thefts either. He simply listened to Taylor and Clark espouse their ideas, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow. After watching Siobhan and the other 2 women disappear around the corner, Dorothy made her way upstairs. Taylor and Brooke had already returned to the office they all shared and were reporting back to Inspector Derwent and Sergeant Clark, who, judging by the outdoor coats they were still wearing, had only recently returned.